we have produced in the last 15 years in a cottage industry of professionals whose job has been to make money off of selling you their approach to collaboration. Now, these aren't bad people. Some of them have actually generated results in some places. Reality is that most of the folks who have been doing this have examples of where it's worked, and these are the ones that they hold up, these are the ones that they write about in the chapters. You also ought to know that for every example they hold up, there are 7, 8, 9, 10 other places that did, on the surface, what they were asked to do, and they didn't have any big results. It probably didn't hurt their school, but they didn't have these dramatic results. And this is, be clear, this is not a condemnation of Marzano, DeFore, Reeves. I think these folks have added considerably to the field. But the places that make the most out of those resources are places that are incredibly skeptical and are constantly adjusting these resources to the needs of their school as opposed to just trying to blindly implement other people's work. One of the reasons I think this is so hard to do is you're actually pushing against a culture that is not designed for collaboration. Most of us were socialized into this profession at a time, well, some of us were professionalized into this culture at a time where there weren't structure. It wasn't a given that you would have time during the school day to actually work with other adults on the craft of teaching and learning. You might have met once every 2 weeks after school for a department meeting or a faculty meeting. You rarely had meeting. You might have had planning times, and occasionally you individually reached out. But these schools are institutions that have been designed to make us individual craftspeople, toiling away at 90% of our work in front of the kids we're serving, but rarely in front of other adults to do our work. And it need not be that way, but it has been that way. And it's not just the structure that has had a cultural impact. And I want to summarize an article I thought about sending to you, but it's a little academic, a little wonky, and a little dated, but I think its basic premise still holds. And it kind of gives us a flavor of why this is such a big lift to create a really deep professional collaborative culture. In 1991, Judith Warren Little wrote a piece that is a very well-cited piece. It is very well read. Even in doctoral programs today, a couple decades later, it's not uncommon to have this in the main syllabus of kind of the organization of the culture of schools, the organization development of schools. The piece is called "The Persistence of Privacy." Written in 1991, it's published in Teacher College Record if you're interested in finding it. But I'll boil it down for you. Judith Warren Little is a sociologist of education. Spends a lot of time inside schools watching the patterns of adults and kids, how things interact, and naming the things that get so familiar to us we can't even name them. It's just like wallpaper. Most of us we just operate in that as a reality. Well, her job is to surface the color of that wallpaper that's been up there for 3 decades that you don't even pay attention to anymore and say, do you really want this wallpaper up? And she wrote this piece that said, if you look across all patterns of collaboration among teachers in education, it basically falls into 4 categories, whether people call it those categories or not. First was storytelling. So this is teachers sitting around going, back in the good old days, let me tell you about how that's, or let me tell you what happened in second period with this kid that I wanted to throttle. It's not an unimportant piece, and she doesn't make light of it. And storytelling is an important part of transferring the cultural values of an institution and even society. Storytelling is a really important part of passing on from generation to generation the values of the culture. But, and I'll come back to it. Second, aid and assistance. This is where individual people reach out to other individual people for discrete problems. So I'm a first-year teacher. I've never taught Mesopotamia before. I don't even know where Mesopotamia is on a map. And I've got to teach it tomorrow. So I walk down the hall and say to my department chair, Cheryl, do you have anything on Mesopotamia? I need some help. I need some notes. I need some graphic organizers. I need your assessment. Anything you can give me, great. This is really useful, but it's also not a systemic one. It usually is individuals, and it's often between people who develop really special relationships as professionals, or between more novice people and more senior people. Again, has value, but it's not systemic, it tends to be not the default way of collaborating, but kind of in microcosms. Sharing resources. Now this is a more common systemic approach. It's where teachers sit around the table together and say, hey, can I see your test that you gave for quadratic equations? I need a few more questions in mine. I'd like to borrow some of yours. Or where do you pull your notes on World War II so that they're better than the ones in this pretty awful textbook that we use? And we say, oh, I use this Glencoe summary document. Here, pull from that. Again, not a bad thing. These are important. But what Judith's premise is that the vast majority of collaboration that occurred in U.S. schools happened in one of these three categories. And in fact, it had very limited impact in the basic ways we teach in our classrooms. Marginal. So I might have a new resource here. Or maybe I, as an individual teacher, reach out for a little while, but then I stop asking as I get more and more comfortable over time. And then this is just kind of ways of passing on beliefs and values. She said that the one that happens the least, but the one that has the biggest impact, is what she labeled joint work. This is where adults get together in the presence of other adults and they build something together. So instead of sharing something, they say, hey, let's co-construct our unit on pendulums. And let's construct the objectives together. Let's construct the lessons, the daily lessons together. Let's co-construct the assessment together. And she says that approach tends to have a bigger impact upon people's individual practice because you're actually having to co-construct something with someone and it has value and it pays off. And when these opportunities are created for people purposefully across the school, you're more likely to have a deeper professional collaborative structure. Now, the caveats I'll put on this, when this was written, no one was talking about PLCs. When that was written, no one was talking about data teams. We knew data existed. We just didn't have data teams yet. And we had department meetings, we sometimes had grade level meetings, but it often was not embedded in the school. This is a phenomenon of the last 15 years, really the last decade. So things might have changed. I think there are probably more examples of joint work, but I'll say the culture of schools, when I go drop into schools that I don't know, so everything feels a little foreign to me, and when I look at the structures, there's still a whole lot of this going on. And structures that seemingly are about this, but when you really look at what's happening, it's a lot more of this happening. So data teams are occurring, but in reality, they're looking at data, they share some resources, and then they go on and looking at data the next day, but they don't actually get to co-constructing lessons together, sharing lessons, go visiting each other's classrooms to do that kind of lesson study work that you might find in Japan or Korea. So just another layer to this, so another way of thinking about it. And the reason I want to put this out there is to push you to not take for granted that collaboration, as you define it, in fact leads to improvements in the classroom.